so much, everyone, for the very, very warm welcome to the university. Thank you so much to Kamudhu, to Professor Karunatilaka, and to Vice-Chancellor Nilanthi de Silva for the very, very warm invitation and the support that you have given me. And I can only hope that my presentation reflects the interest that you have given to this subject, and that we can have a very fruitful conversation in relation to conflict, both from the Irish but also the Sri Lankan perspective. So what I would first like to do is I would like to start from a working knowledge, a very base working knowledge of the conflict in Northern Ireland, because I find, like many people, conflict can often be misunderstood, it can be misinterpreted, but particularly Sri Lanka and Ireland, or Northern Ireland, as post-colonial states, as islands with a lot of geostrategic importance, with a history of conflict stemming from colonialism, can offer a lot of insights into one another. So my talk today is divided into three sections because, like most post-colonial states, dates are extremely important in getting to the root of the cause of violent conflict, but also helping us to understand it. So first, I want to address the context, and I want to provide an overview of the origins of the conflict in Northern Ireland. Secondly, I want to give a critical evaluation of the conflict, particularly the notion of Northern Ireland as a post-conflict society, which is something that is often phrased in a certain way, but unfortunately is not the case. And in particularly, I would like to talk about the paradox of peace. So in the context of positive peace and the context of negative peace, I would like to talk about Northern Ireland as a state of negative peace. And lastly, I want to talk about how, from my personal experience, as Kamudhu mentioned, I am very much committed to Freirean praxis. So my teaching is informed by my experience on the ground, lived experience of communities who have been involved in violent conflict in one way, shape, or the other, so affected and impacted, but also experience in empowering communities, marginalized groups and affected groups. So how basically can we reconcile oppression in conflict societies by peace building from the grassroots and the community level? And how, if possible, could this be applied in the Sri Lankan context? So firstly, I have a map of Ireland here. I would like to just to start with talking about the island of Ireland. It is divided into two separate jurisdictions, the South, or the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland. So the South, or the Republic of Ireland, is a sovereign independent nation. Northern Ireland is one of 4 counties of England. It is also often described as a province by officials and authorities. So, in relation to key periods in time, in relation to Northern Ireland, I think it's very important that we are able to discern significant changes and shifts in the Irish question. It's often framed as the Irish problem, but I would like to reorient this and reframe this in terms of the Irish question, because it has been problematized repeatedly, but this is a very strong colonial discourse, an imperialistic discourse that is lasting with us today. However, the question aims to frame it more as a solution going forward, so a solution for Irish unity and Ireland as a full, independent, sovereign island. So, from the 12th century, and about a century after the Norman conquest of England, Henry II claimed and attempted to attach Ireland to his kingdom. So control was established over a small geographical area in Dublin, also referred to as the Pale. So over the next 4 centuries, this area became the foothold for the Kingdom of Ireland as an extension of British rule. So we adopted English administrative practices, language, and culture. So several attempts were made during the period to extend English control over the rest of Ireland, but the major expansion did not happen until centuries later with the plantation of Ulster. So, with the plantation of Ulster, the political history of Ireland evolved quite significantly. And this struggle for power connected religion to nationalism and to politics, as religion was the key driver between dominant and dominated sectors of society. So being linked to attempts by the Protestant English state to colonize and to anglicize Ireland, both for political but also importantly for economic advantage, such as land resources and of course human labor. Ireland was also noted as a security threat to Britain as a launch pad for foreign invasion and foreign threats. So this was quite significant as well because Ireland had a stubborn adherence to Catholicism. So, you know, it was a Roman Catholic country. And that really magnified that perceived threat considerably. So religion became the primary vehicle for dividing and leveraging this. So geopolitically, Ireland provided a lot of strategic importance, both politically but also resource-wise. You know, we saw the confiscation of native Catholic the population, which was given to the newer Protestant community. So it was done through a combination of bribery and force, techniques that we well know in post-colonial states, to enhance its own territorial and political security. But this plantation was unique amongst Irish plantations as it set out to attract colonists from all areas. So military conquest had been established across Ireland at this point, with the exception of Ulster, so the north of Ireland, which managed to keep it and fight for its own geographical area. But it was eventually brought under English control, and by 1703, less than 5% of the land was still in the hands of Catholic Irish. So excluded from towns by planters, Irish were banned to the mountains and bogs on the margins of the land that they had previously owned. Importantly, I want to emphasize that now this same territory in Ulster was occupied by two hostile groups. So one group believing that the land had been usurped and the other believing that their tenure was constantly under threat from attack. So they lived in separate quarters. Their places were identified, and they identified their differences as religious as well as culture. So often, you know, Northern Ireland is referred to as a sectarian ethnic conflict, which is incorrect. It is not an ethnic conflict. It is primarily sectarian. So, just moving very briefly on to partition, 1921 saw the partition of Ireland, so a southern 26 counties and the establishment of a northern state, so 6 separate counties, which was administered by British. Okay, so this was the largest area which could be comfortably held within a majority. In 1967, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was formed to demand an end to disadvantage through housing, education, healthcare, where Irish Catholics were less than second-class citizens and did not have access to basic services. What we had was the establishment of a contemporary armed wing, the Irish Republican Army, and that began a campaign of violence, particularly in relation to British rule, but also the introduction of internment in 1971. So this newly formed Provisional Irish Republican Army, or IRA, you know, it essentially developed strongly from 1972 on the back of the civil rights movement, and instead riots between Catholics and Protestants, which had previously categorized the 1960s to the 1970s, this conflict increasingly took the form of violence between the Provisional IRA and the British Army, with occasional interventions by loyalist paramilitaries. And the last 2 points I want to refer to are the Troubles. So the Troubles is a very light-hearted phrase given to a 30-year-long, very bloody and violent conflict in Northern Ireland from the late 1960s to 1998 by Protestant Unionists, also referred to as Loyalists, who desired the province to remain part of the United Kingdom, but also Roman Catholic nationalists or Republicans who wanted Northern Ireland to become part of the Republic of Ireland. So, tactics included street fighting, bombings, sniper attacks, roadblocks, and internment without trial. Over 3,600 were killed, 30,000 more were wounded before 1998, and we saw tens of thousands of refugees fleeing Northern Ireland. So this eventually led to the Good Friday, also known as the Belfast Agreement, which was a peace plan and a power-sharing mandate between Belfast, Dublin and London in the Northern Ireland Assembly at Stormont, to which it remains this day. But I want to highlight that being from Northern Ireland now, as we can see, is not just a cultural identity, but it's become a political identity. So the resistance of Indigenous people to the settler colonial project of Britain was not just a struggle for liberation, but it was a struggle against extermination. Until 1921, what we saw was essentially an Irish-English problem, or a question, and it focused on Ireland's attempts to secure independence from Britain. But from 1921, the emphasis shifted to relationships within the island of Ireland. And from 1969, attention is focused on relationships between Catholics and Protestants within Northern Ireland. However, faith cannot be separated from politics. It is a Christian theological and a British imperial agenda where those who are a faith community and have been recategorized and reclassified as a separate people and a political community. So to move on to the reference to Northern Ireland as a post-conflict society, and I will be using some images, some contemporary images of Northern Ireland at the moment. This image is from 2021, from the Belfast riots, where we saw near 2 weeks of rioting and conflict across the entirety of the north, preliminary within 3 counties. And this was sparked by the Northern Ireland Protocol during the Brexit negotiations. So a simple point on a trade agreement was something that sparked nearly 14 days of violent conflict. So Northern Ireland, the peace process has largely been portrayed in Europe and also internationally as an exemplary model of peace building. But a counterpoint to that is it is constantly referred to as relative peace. Okay, so we have relative peace, potential peace, and it's really referred to in the absence of direct, explicit violence, which is sparking at various times with the smallest of flames that ignite it. And that is where it's very important for us to focus on the aspect of structural violence and inequality, because what we can see are patterns of exploitation, of poverty, of alienation and inequality every single time by giving it a very clear social scientific and political scientific analysis that can actually help us predict the outbreak of violence at certain times and certain places. These high levels of multiple deprivation, as I hope to show you, are these indicators of negative peace. So peace, yes, it may last at a certain level, the top level. However, it's very different from the communities on the ground. So just to tie this to this paradox that we find, is it's a very contentious paradox of peace in Northern Ireland. So neither side has resolved their political difference, however, over violence. And I want to emphasize it's not over. I have it as in it's over for the moment. So nationalist and Republican and unionist and loyalist political aspirations remain in conflict, and collective accounts of history and historical injustices and rights are contradictory. They have never been reconciled, to the point that Ireland, the very idea of establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Ireland, has sparked outbreaks of violence and riots. Okay, so I think it's really important when we talk about this that peace has been made so far as the political level, but aside from paramilitary and political leaders, it is not translating to the community level. So a question I want to pose is it possible that Northern Ireland is a case of top-down reconciliation with limited interpersonal relationship building at the level of affected communities? And what I want to show you here, this picture is of a peace wall, okay? And I have, I like pictures. I'm a visual learner, and I really, really like pictures. So hopefully you like pictures too, otherwise you're not going to like this. So to the left here, we have piece by piece, and the second piece is spelled P-I-E-C-E, I think is very poignant. And Ireland, if you go to Northern Ireland, the first thing you will see is visual lines of demarcation. So these are visible divisions within communities, but we also see the geographical separation of Protestant and Catholic communities. So today, we have a community divided. We have 30.5 kilometers of peace walls, okay, which were set up to divide Protestant and Catholic communities. And there's a total of 97 different barriers in the forms of defensive architecture. So walls, fences, spikes, metal gates, and closed roads. So these are primarily in very impoverished communities of the northwest and east of Belfast City, and they also travel into Derry. And they separate these areas from one another. What you often see is a large focus on murals as well. So murals depicting history of the conflict, either from a nationalist or from a loyalist perspective. So you have a lot of focus on Protestant iconography and then also Roman Catholic iconography, a lot of flags, a lot of phrases. And this here is the iconic Derry Wall. You are now entering Free Derry, but often it is painted and repainted to reflect different contemporary political developments. So it could be painted maybe once every 5 months. It could be painted once every 2 years, repainted over by local political activist groups. And we also see there on the top right-hand corner, just to draw your attention to road signs. So as you start to travel up north, if we're driving on a bus or on a car, increasingly you will see changes in references to Derry. So the county of Derry is also referred to from a unionist, a British perspective, as Londonderry. So you actually see this play out, this conflict within road signage and everyday signage. So to the point that these signs can be burned as well. So these dynamics of conflict, what I am proposing and what we have been doing on the ground is focusing on rooting and shifting conflict from sectarianism to a much more important problem of material deprivation. So the conflict in the north is only in part sectarian. A narrow interpretation for us as academics, as community workers, as practitioners of complex conflict as solely sectarian, as solely religious, ethnic, racial, is always reductive and in some cases can be damaging. A blind focus on religion, especially in the context of the North, it conceals the structural issues and the root causes of violence that result in these continuous outbreaks. But importantly, if we focus on patterns of material deprivation and inequality, we can look to those commonalities. So the shared experience of communities, so social justice, rights, austerity measures as well. to look at ways that we can initiate intercultural, interfaith, and intercommunal dialogue between mutually impacted communities and help bridge divisions through tapping into a different experience, a different lived experience, a shared lived experience to create a shared identity between groups. And it's also referred to, equality between Catholics and Protestants within Northern Ireland. Sociologist Kieran Allen in University College Dublin continuously highlights that there is equality between Protestants and Catholics, and this equality is an equality of poverty and an equality of injustice, with mass disillusionment amongst these nationalist and this Protestant population. So just to build on this, the correlation of poverty and violence, to use empirical examples, becomes especially important in order to map those patterns of political violence in the capital, so in Belfast. Geographical, religious, gender, and age distribution of deaths is overwhelmingly within marginalised and impacted, impoverished communities. To highlight this, over 94 postcodes in Northern Ireland exist, but over half the fatalities during the 30-year conflict of the Troubles were concentrated in just 12 postcode areas. Now, to emphasise, Northern Ireland is a very, very small area. Ireland is a very, very small island. So 12 postcodes is much smaller than it would be in Sri Lanka, and especially in Colombo. So you're talking about small communities of a couple of thousand people. So these were concentrated in just 12, and these were areas that were the most harshly impacted by economic deprivation, but also became fertile breeding ground for recruitment to paramilitary organizations as well, the most disenfranchised and the most impacted by structural inequality of political parties in Northern Ireland Assembly. 18 of those 20 poorest areas in the region today are to be found in 2 parliamentary constituencies, which is really, it's really stark when you think about it. But as well, these also tie into those communities where those walls, the peace walls, have been erected. So those peace walls account for 14 out of 20 of the most deprived wards in Northern Ireland. So with this, we see more examples of the visual demarcation of territory. So to the point that you can tell by walking from one community to another, the change in it being a Protestant community to a Catholic community simply by looking at the ground where you are walking. So the pavement stones start off by being coloured in the Irish flag, the green, white and gold, and very suddenly, as you turn a corner, can shift to red, white and blue to highlight that you are walking into a very specific territory in which claim has been laid to. We also see parades, we see marches, which often erupt in conflict as well. So bombs at certain periods. July the 12th, we also have bonfire night. Okay, so this is also referred to as the 11th night, where you see bonfires across the world, across the north, erected in different communities. So up to a serious height, often decorated with Irish flags, Irish elected politicians or political candidates, peace activists and community development workers. Their faces will be on it, maybe nooses, mock nooses, and maybe mock gallows as well. So just to tie this into the historical memory and the legacy of colonialism, because we can see this, this is very stark in the context of Ireland, but to emphasise that a new generation was born in the early 90s, the generation out of this Good Friday Agreement, also referred to as the ceasefire babies, because that was when a ceasefire was primarily declared. However, a huge amount of young people are involved in these riots. A huge amount of young people are being actively recruited to paramilitary organizations because this inequality has not only not been tackled, but it has been exacerbated. For example, with the peace walls, which were due to be taken down, but have actually multiplied in number since. So history, Falconer and Lichty are two Northern Irish theorists of conflict, and they argue that history can hold a community captive with culture enforcing it. So the cohesiveness and the sense of direction of the community is nourished by its memories and shapes the current identity of communities and its members. But these memories provide a framework for interpreting daily life, our actions and how we go about them. So they determine our attitudes, our relationships, and they permeate the individual. And we often have, attempts at, talking to young people between a certain age. So from the age to, from 2 to about 10, maybe 11, children are very open. They're very open and open-minded, but very, very quickly from the ages of 10 to 15, what you see is a significant shift and narrowing of attitudes. And often what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the root cause of that. You see a lot of cross-community reconciliation initiatives which are focused at bringing children from Protestant and from Catholic backgrounds together to try and focus on developing a relational identity. So how one interacts with the other is absolutely essential to understanding the role of religion, but also the other underlying dynamics in conflict societies. John Hoffman in Beyond the State, he wrote that no one can understand themselves unless they understand the other. So this is where I come to both lived experience, but also a call and an argument for people who are practicing in peace and conflict, or people who are addressing inequality through research, through practice, through teaching. So for the students in this college in social sciences, but involved maybe in reconciliation and peace studies, the need to build practice. So it is not enough to stop at education. Education must function for liberation. Because if it does not seek to function for liberation, it will function to oppress. And we need to look at how we tackle those boundaries from the classroom, from the university, the college, to outside of the college. So what is it that we are doing in practice to teach ourselves about the other? Okay, so how can we learn more about ourselves from interacting more with other community groups? Ideally, the ones that we often find ourselves in conflict with. So this helps the creation of new meanings of coexistence. So how can we connect and relate to the other, but also ideally provide foundations to empower both communities, but also to recognize and challenge systemic forces that oppress them by linking both the individual atomized person who is feeling alienated to collective rights. So instead of looking at it as an I issue, but looking at it as a we issue, where rights and responsibilities can be viewed as relational. Just to use a quote by Alice Walker, we often talk about this, and I start this conversation with students or community groups. We talk about power. Because ultimately this is a conflict over, imperialism, fought out on very specific lines. And when we talk about power, you have people who are really, really impacted from these communities saying, well, I don't do anything. I want the conflict to be resolved. Most of the communities in that area want the walls to come down. But the fundamental point that they always come back to is, I just don't have, what can I do? I am just one individual. I am one individual, or we are one community. There is nothing that we can do. So it's that feeling of disempowerment. There is no interest in taking a liberative reconciliation towards communities, because it does not advantage political parties that have established themselves either primarily as unionist or primarily as Republican. It benefits these parties to have inscribed within them these divisions, because it shields and it deflects from the underlying issues that are happening at community level. But fundamentally, it's really important to emphasize that Protestant and Catholic communities have both suffered under the conditions emerging from the threat of minority status. Okay, both feel minoritized, both have a collective victimhood when it comes to this, but also the continuing problems of social and economic inequality play out through religious differences, which only perpetuate conflict at a political level and deflect from the wider issue of structural violence that is imposed towards both communities. So how do we transform conflict in practice? So the most significant gains we have made in the last 10 to 15 years in Northern Ireland have been through social movements. So identity-based, progressive, more liberal social movements. So what we have here is a campaign to light up Northern Ireland Stormont Assembly in rainbow colours to mark the month of Pride. What we also see is community areas where you have shops, restaurants and bars who have openly declared themselves as neither Catholic nor Protestant, neither loyalist or Republican, but feminist, or for LGBTQ rights, or for socialist. So the specific shifting of identity markers by geographical areas reflecting in transformation of colour and therefore identity and these signifiers. So it's a very political claim to physically transform your local area and your community. This particular bar is also known as the Sunflower Pub, and it prides itself on being welcome to absolutely everyone, despite your political or your religious views. The entire point is, if you come here, it is an inclusive space, and it is an inclusive space for everyone in the community. We also have the Derry Walls. So, of course, Northern Ireland, the techniques that are used in Palestine were also used. The exact settler colonial project was used in Palestine as was used in the north of Ireland. The two communities hold a shared affiliation for one another. There is a lot of international solidarity and cooperation with a lot of people from Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland going over to Palestine and being very active in Palestine. We have a very strong relationship internationally. So we see international solidarity in local areas. We also see during COVID-19, the National Health Service was paying tribute to our frontline workers, and that is normally how the building stands, one of the most iconic and famous walls in Ireland. So just to finish up, and to bring it back to thinking about the ways that we can reconcile oppression and how we can build unity, is sometimes opportunities for building unity and for building solidarity can come together in the most desperate of times. So times that are filled with despair, filled with fear and panic, are the times that can really be important for creating shared meaning, a shared identity, and coexistence. So what we have here is we have the Northern Ireland Public Transport Workers Union. So these union workers, pictured at the bottom, were targeted during the Belfast riots repeatedly in 2021. So we saw multiple buses going to every area being bombed, being set alight, and arson attacks. So bus workers were terrified and very fearful for themselves. So both Protestant and Catholic bus workers came together to engage in strike action, but also to make an appeal to the community to please stop targeting bus drivers who were both Catholic and who were Protestant, and maybe neither. So in order for us to overcome these relationships that are built and grounded in an oppressive history, we need to recognize that this character of oppression is relational. So instead of getting stuck in identities that are pitched in binary opposition to one another, which is the method of colonial rule, that we need to look at networks of responsibilities to one another, because acknowledging that you and I as individuals have multiple social roles, it helps us to focus not in terms of who we are, but on what we want to achieve. So right now, with climate change and an increasing focus on environmental degradation, we are really trying to push environmental initiatives and bring communities together over a shared concern for our future and for the planet as well. And in terms of social movements in the South, we have seen tens of buses going up to the North to show solidarity in relation to feminist movements or in relation to sexual violence. So people to come up to join for mass protests. And these are the times in which the physical boundaries between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland are exposed as a sham. And highlighted for exactly how porous they can be when people are uniting together. So that is the question and the argument for building political solidarity. And I just want to end on a question about how we can conceive the relational nature and the character of oppression in different contexts to inform how we can build peace. And also, another question is there potential for an emancipatory form of positive peace where those who are most marginalized and disadvantaged, basically can achieve, actualization and basically, engage in a form of self-empowerment. So those are the two questions I want to pose to everyone, and I think I really am quite happy with the turnout, because I think in cases where, I'm more question posing than problem posing, it would really, really be great to hear some of your insights and some of your shared thoughts. I know I put out a lot here, but I really do welcome any feedback, any communication, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. So thank you very much.